Hello and welcome. How is the United States safer today, 8 years after 9/11? Well, many wonder if the world's only superpower really has strengthened its ability to handle security threats. That was the issue at the top of the agenda for the Chief of Homeland Security in America. For 4 years during the Bush administration, Michael Chertoff had to deal with major challenges, from investigating the 9/11 attacks and bioterrorism to cybersecurity and even the impact of Hurricane Katrina. Prior to becoming the Secretary of the DHS, Mr. Chertoff was Assistant Attorney General who created the Enron Task Force, which resulted in more than 20 convictions, and had spent more than a decade as a federal prosecutor in New Jersey and New York, where he was known for successfully taking on the mafia. Currently, he runs the Chertoff Group, a risk management firm based in Washington and New York, to advise corporate clients and governments on a range of security concerns. He's also just written a book, Homeland Security, Assessing the First 5 Years, which is being released in the US on Tuesday and internationally later in September. So today we ask Michael Chertoff, what security challenges does the United States face in the post-9/11 era? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE. You can enter the chat room and take part, and we'll take your phone calls on the show as well. Secretary Chertoff, great to have you here. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good to be on.
Thank you, sir. Do you really believe America is safer after 9/11?
I think it is safer. We're not totally safe, but we are safer because of all the measures that have been put into place over the last 8 years to strengthen our borders, to strengthen our transportation infrastructure. Obviously, the steps we've taken overseas to attack terrorists in their safe havens. But of course, it's a dynamic process, and they evolve, and we have to adapt to meet the new challenges.
Now, many people who say that, often who defend the practices of the Bush administration say the reason America is safer, the evidence is that there's been no attack on American soil since 9/11, or no major attack. But considering what's happening in Afghanistan, happening in Iraq, the fact Americans have become targets globally, there's often a negative attitude to America. Hasn't it really been just a change in the theater of engagement, that it's shifted overseas?
Well, of course, you have to recognize, first and foremost, the responsibility of the president is to protect Americans in their own home country. And the fact that there are attacks overseas rather than successful attacks in the U.S. underscores the fact that we have made it much more difficult for terrorists to attack here in the United States. Now, ideally, we'd like to make it more difficult for them to attack anywhere, and that's, of course, a great deal of what we're trying to achieve working with our friends and allies overseas, including in Afghanistan.
Now, the term war on terror became a political sort of rallying cry. Many people believed it was a way to exert greater control over America through encouraging a climate of fear. And in your book, you even talk about the necessity not to get complacent, that people shouldn't get complacent about security. But how long can the country maintain a level of vigil that, I mean, it's pretty stressful where it is right now?
I think what we want to do is we want to be someplace between complacency and hysteria. In other words, in a steady state in which we're capable of being prepared, being focused, but not being preoccupied or obsessed. Look, we went through the Cold War for a period of over 50 years. And there was a low-level anxiety, obviously, during that entire period, but people went about their daily lives. At the same time, we did, during that period, invest in national defense because of the threat we faced. Now, happily, the Cold War is behind us, or largely behind us. We face another enduring threat. We don't need to have people obsessed with it or consistently and constantly brooding about it, but we do need to be able to dedicate ourselves and persevere in making sure we're taking adequate security steps.
So let me quote you from the book, Homeland Security, you've just released, where you talk about ideals. Here you say, I portray the fight against global terrorism as a contest between the ideals of freedom and those of tyranny. It's a battle for hearts and minds as well as territory, and its outcome will depend on our ability to resist complacency and retain our resolve and belief in the rightness of our cause. Isn't the problem, though, that America, through its actions overseas, has largely, or has lost the battle for our hearts and minds, and that it's been pushing its ideals based on its sort of own Western ideals, often on cultures that don't relate to it?
Well, I don't think we want to push Western ideals on cultures that don't relate to it. At the same time, I don't agree with those who say, well, in many parts of the world, like the Middle East or South Asia, people aren't interested in having any kind of rights. Women shouldn't be educated. They don't have any need for democracy. They're perfectly happy to live under some kind of a dictatorship. I think most people fundamentally do want to have freedom. They do want to have respect. They do want to have women having the right to be educated and live fulfilling lives, so that giving people the opportunity to cherish those ideals, but admittedly within the context of their own culture, is, I think, what is in the long-term interest not only of the United States, but the entire globe.
Sir, I'm going to get a call in here from London. We've got Anwar on the line. Anwar, what would you like to ask?
Oh, hello, good evening.
Right.
Two very simple questions. Two-thirds of the world believes that 9/11 was planned. That's one thing. Anthrax, WMDs, all those lies. I don't think America is in such a strong position. I don't think anybody is going to attack United States of America. That is one point. Secondly, I would like to say because there, as you know, Michael, you know that there is a lobby who wants to create wars and wars in the world, because history has proved that that very thing. Now in Afghanistan, they are training thousands and maybe millions of Afghanis, and don't you think they are going to use them against maybe Pakistan and against China with the coordination of Israel and India?
Okay, Anwar, thank you.
So first, I'm going to say I really doubt that two-thirds of people believe that 9/11 was not an attack caused by Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden himself admitted it. It's been admitted numerous times by leaders. They boast about it. It's not a big secret. So, you'll find people who believe the Earth is flat and the moon is made out of green cheese. I want to waste a lot of time on that. In terms of what we see in Afghanistan, in order to see what's at stake, you only have to see the photographs that were shown on this network about an hour ago of someone who went to vote in the polls, was captured by the Taliban, had his ear and his nose cut off. So that picture is worth 1,000 words and speaks to the kinds of issues that we're fighting for, both on behalf of Americans and behalf of Afghanis.
So we had a question from our Facebook page from a viewer by the name of Rehan Shakur, who wrote in saying, "Why are Americans so self-centered? The question should be, is the world safer than it was before 9/11?
Well, I agree with that. I mean, I don't think Americans should only focus on Americans, although it's not going to come as a surprise that an American president feels his first obligation is to his own country, as does the Prime Minister of Great Britain or the President of a Middle Eastern country. But that being said, I fully agree that it is really the world that has to be safer. We can't be safe in the United States if our friends and allies around the world are not safe themselves.
Interesting you raised that, but I want to quote something from your book on where you refer to international law and how it affects America. I was intrigued to read, you said, every nation is confronted by a developing framework of international law that can often be a hindrance rather than a help to our collective security needs. That suggests that the US is better off going it alone and not being tied
Actually, if you read the whole chapter, I say quite the contrary. What I say is international law is important, but we need to understand how international law is developed and what its reach is in order to make sure it's performing the proper function in the world. If international law reflects the consensus of nations, and particularly the consent of those being governed, then it has legitimacy and we ought to be paying attention to it. If it reflects what we sometimes see, which is the writings of certain academics or certain judges who have a very narrow view based on their own political agenda, then I think international law really doesn't fulfill the promise that it should have as a broad-based reflection of our fundamental values around the globe.
So then what's your view on the way America often stands apart from the rest of the world community on signing on to international protocols, the International Criminal Court, the Kyoto Protocols? There's so many labor laws. The US seems to stand apart, though it preaches a certain direction and then stands away from it.
Well, I think fundamentally it reflects the fact that as a democracy, we want to make sure before we sign up to a commitment that it reflects our willingness to abide by it. There are countries who sign all kinds of international treaties and then proceed to ignore them. I think Americans fundamentally believe that if they're going to sign something, they should do it with the desire to actually abide by the rules. Sometimes we have philosophical differences with a treaty. Sometimes we have institutional things that make it impossible for us to sign. But I think America has also been a leader in many respects in terms of moving the world forward towards freedom and democracy.
Let me get a quick listen to a soundbite from former Vice President Dick Cheney, who was very vocal in defending the Bush era and saying, this is what he had to say on Fox News to Chris Wallace just a couple of days ago. If you listen to this, sir.
Chris, my sort of overwhelming view is that the enhanced interrogation techniques were absolutely essential in saving thousands of American lives, in preventing further attacks against the United States, and giving us the intelligence we needed to go find Al-Qaeda, to find their camps, to find out how they were being financed.
The problem is that Osama bin Laden's still out there. Al-Qaeda is actually growing into a sort of international movement, an ideology that's sort of almost self-fueled and self-growing with a life of its own. What does that say for what Dick Cheney is claiming there?
Well, I think what the Vice President is referring to are some documents that were released about a week ago by the Inspector General of the CIA and I think the CIA as well as a whole, that talked about some of the plots that were uncovered and frustrated as a result of the interrogation of detainees, in particular plots involving attacks on the United States, a potential attack on Karachi, Pakistan, which was frustrated. And might I say, by the way, these are attacks directed not only at Americans, but at people in Pakistan, Muslims, who are going to be the victims of these attacks. So in that sense, I think what he's pointing to are the results in terms of saving lives. In terms of where al-Qaeda is as a global movement, I think it's actually suffered some setbacks. You know, about a year ago, Ayman Zawahiri had a town hall meeting and was bitterly criticized because what they were doing, what al-Qaeda was doing, was killing Muslim school children in Algeria. And he tried to explain it and excuse it and say it was justified. But I can't believe many people around the world think a movement that will kill Muslim school children is actually promoting a legitimate view of Islam.
So I'm going to ask you to stand by. We're going to take a very short break here. As we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see there's a debate taking place in there right now. We'll be right back.